The ballroom smelled like money and lies. Noelle had learned to recognize both in her 3 years working private events in the city: champagne masking desperation, designer gowns hiding debts, laughter that never quite reached anyone's eyes. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. She adjusted the silver tray in her hands, weaving between clusters of men in custom suits who spoke in low voices and women who wore their jewelry like armor. The Volkov Foundation's annual gala, they'd called it. A charity event. She'd almost laughed when she read the job posting. Everyone who worked these circuits knew what the Volkov name really meant, what kind of charity they were actually interested in. But the pay was triple her usual rate, and her mother's medical bills didn't care about the moral complexity of Russian crime families. Noelle had rules for nights like this. Keep your head down. Don't make eye contact. Smile politely but don't engage. Deliver the drinks, collect the empty glasses, become invisible. She'd perfected the art of being present without being seen, a skill that had kept her safe in rooms where being noticed could be dangerous. She was reaching for an empty champagne flute on a high table when she felt it, that particular quality of silence that meant someone was watching. Not the casual glance of someone flagging down a server, but the weight of sustained attention. The kind that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Noelle turned slowly, and that's when she saw him. He stood near the far window, backlit by the city lights beyond, and even from across the room, the power radiating from him was unmistakable. Tall, with dark hair styled with deliberate casualness and a jaw that looked carved from stone. He wore his tuxedo the way some men wore weapons, with absolute confidence that he could destroy you with it if necessary. His eyes, even at this distance, were locked on her with an intensity that made her forget to breathe. This had to be him. Kyrion Dobrov. The man whose name people spoke carefully, as if saying it too loud might summon him. The Russian who'd consolidated half the city's underground operations before he turned 30. The one they called the Winter King, because his control was absolute and his mercy was rare. And he was looking at her like she was the only person in a room of 300. Noelle forced herself to look away, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was exactly what she'd trained herself to avoid. Attention from men like that never ended well. She moved toward the kitchen, keeping her pace steady, professional, unremarkable. But she could still feel his gaze following her like a physical touch, tracking her movement across the room. You need to be more careful. The voice came from beside her as she pushed through the kitchen door. Marcus, the head of tonight's catering staff, looked worried. He was a good man, former military, who'd helped her land this gig. I saw him watching you. I wasn't doing anything, Noelle said, loading her tray with fresh glasses. That's exactly the problem, Marcus replied quietly. Men like Dobrov don't need a reason. They see something they want, they take it. And he was looking at you like, he stopped himself, shaking his head. Just stay in the kitchen for the rest of the night. I'll handle the main floor. Every part of Noelle wanted to agree. Wanted to hide in the safety of steel counters and fluorescent lights until this night was over and she could go home and forget about dark eyes that saw too much. But hiding meant missing out on tips, and tips meant the difference between making her mother's next specialist appointment or having to reschedule again. I'll be fine, she said, lifting the tray. I know how to be invisible. Nobody's invisible to him, Marcus warned, but he didn't try to stop her. The rest of the evening passed in mounting tension. Noelle kept to the edges of the ballroom, serving quickly and efficiently, avoiding the center where she'd spotted Kyrion Dobrov speaking with a circle of men who hung on his every word. She didn't look in his direction. Didn't let herself check if he was still watching. But her skin prickled with awareness, and she knew. It was near midnight when everything changed. Noelle was collecting glasses from a corner table when she heard raised voices. Not unusual at these events. Wealthy men drinking expensive liquor often led to arguments. But this was different. The voices were sharp with genuine anger, and the crowd was moving away from the source like a tide retreating before a wave. She should have walked the other way. Should have followed every instinct screaming at her to leave. But she was closer than the kitchen, and the fastest route to safety was past whatever was happening. That's when she saw him, a younger man, barely 20, being held by 2 security guards while an older man in an expensive suit stood before him, face red with fury. The younger man's lip was split, blood dripping onto his white shirt. "You think you can steal from me?" the older man spat. "You think you can take what's mine and I won't make an example of you?" The young man's eyes were wide with fear, darting around the room as if looking for help that everyone knew wouldn't come. And Noelle saw in his face a terror she recognized, the kind that came from knowing you'd made a mistake you couldn't take back, the kind that meant your life was about to change in ways you couldn't survive. It wasn't her business. It couldn't be her business. But her feet had stopped moving, and she was watching as the older man reached inside his jacket, and the crowd pressed back further, and the young man's breathing turned ragged with panic. "Please," the young man choked out. "Please, I have a sister." "Should have thought of that before," the older man said, and his hand emerged holding something dark and metallic. Noelle didn't think. Thinking would have stopped her. Thinking would have reminded her of every reason this was monumentally stupid. Instead, she stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension before she could stop herself. "Excuse me, sir." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a call for you at the front desk." They said it was urgent. It was a ridiculous lie. Transparent and foolish, and exactly the kind of thing that could get her killed in a room full of people who build empires on knowing when someone was lying to them. The older man turned to her slowly, and his eyes were cold calculation. "What did you say?" "The front desk," Noelle repeated, lifting her chin even as her hands trembled around her empty tray. "They said it was urgent." "She's lying," one of the security guards said flatly. "She's just a server." The older man's expression darkened, and Noelle knew with absolute certainty that she'd just made the worst mistake of her life. He took a step toward her, and the temperature in her immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You think you're clever?" His voice was soft, deadly. "You think you can interfere in my business?" Noelle's mouth had gone dry. She'd stepped into something she didn't understand, into currents that ran deeper and darker than she'd imagined. The young man was forgotten now, all that fury and violence had redirected itself toward her, and she had nowhere to go. "I'm sorry," she managed. "I didn't mean." "Put her down," a voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. It wasn't loud. Kyrion Dobrov didn't need to shout. The words carried regardless, slicing through the tension and freezing everyone in place. The entire ballroom went silent, as if someone had hit pause on reality itself. "Now," Kyrion added, and there was something in his tone that suggested dire consequences for disobedience. Noelle turned and found him standing 10 feet away. Up close, he was even more striking, sharp cheekbones, a mouth set in a firm line, and eyes the color of winter storms. But what struck her most was the absolute stillness of him, the sense that he held enormous power under perfect control. The older man's face had gone pale. "Kyrion, I didn't realize, this doesn't concern." "It concerns me now," Kyrion said quietly, his gaze flicking briefly to Noelle before returning to the older man. "She's under my protection. Touch her, and we'll have a different conversation. One you won't enjoy." The words hung in the air, a declaration and a threat wrapped together so neatly that everyone understood exactly what they meant. The older man looked like he wanted to argue, to push back against this unexpected interference, but whatever he saw in Kyrion's expression made him think better of it. "Of course," he said finally, his voice tight. "My apologies. I didn't realize she was yours." Something flickered across Kyrion's face at that last word, but he didn't correct the assumption. "Clean this up," he said, gesturing vaguely at the young man with the split lip. "Quietly. This is supposed to be a civilized event." It was a dismissal and a command, and the older man obeyed immediately, snapping orders at his security guards and dragging the young man away toward an exit. The crowd began to murmur again, the normal sounds of the party resuming as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't all just witnessed something that shifted the power dynamic in the room. Kyrion turned his attention fully to Noelle, and she felt the full weight of his focus like a physical thing. "You're either very brave or very stupid," he said, and there was something almost curious in his tone. I haven't decided which. Stupid, Noelle said before she could stop herself. Definitely stupid. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile but close. Come with me. It wasn't a request. Kyrion Dobrov didn't make requests. But there was something in his voice that wasn't quite a command either, something that gave her the illusion of choice even though they both knew she didn't really have one. Noelle followed him through the ballroom, aware of every eye tracking their movement, aware that she'd just become visible in the worst possible way. He led her to a private balcony overlooking the city, closing the glass door behind them and muting the party noise to a distant hum. What's your name? He asked, turning to face her. Noelle. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted, but at least it didn't shake. Noelle St. Clair. Noelle, he repeated, like he was tasting the syllables. That was a dangerous thing you did back there. Vitaly isn't known for his mercy. I know, she said. I wasn't thinking. That kid looked terrified, and she stopped, realizing how naive she must sound. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause a problem. You didn't cause a problem, Kyrion said, his eyes studying her with that same intense focus from earlier. You intervened in something you didn't understand. That's different. I understand enough, Noelle said, finding some courage in the cool night air. I know what happens at these events. I know who comes to them. I know what you all do. Do you? His voice held a note of challenge. Tell me what you think you know about what I do. Noelle met his gaze, refusing to look away even though every survival instinct told her to. You control things. People. Territory. You make decisions that affect lives, and people follow those decisions because they're more afraid of what happens if they don't. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of what might have been respect or amusement or something darker. That's remarkably accurate for someone who serves drinks for a living. I pay attention, she said. And I've served drinks at enough of these events to know how things work. Yet you stepped in anyway, Kyrion observed. Knowing what you know, you still tried to save someone who made the mistake of stealing from a man who doesn't forget debts. I didn't think, Noelle started, then stopped. Actually, that's not true. I did think. I thought about his sister, the one he mentioned. I thought about what it would feel like to lose someone because they made one stupid mistake. And I thought, she paused, swallowing hard. I thought that maybe, just this once, someone should try to be better than the worst thing they're expected to do. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Kyrion watched her with those storm cloud eyes, and she couldn't read what he was thinking. Couldn't tell if she'd just impressed him or signed her own death warrant. You have no idea how rare that is, he said finally, his voice soft. In rooms like that, in situations like this, no one intervenes. No one takes that risk. Everyone knows better. Maybe I should have known better too, Noelle admitted. Maybe, Kyrion agreed. But you didn't, and now we have a situation. What kind of situation? He moved closer, and Noelle fought the urge to step back. This close, she could see the faint scar along his jawline, could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated. Could feel the way his presence seemed to fill all the available space, leaving no room for anything else. I told Vitaly you're under my protection, Kyrion said. In his world, that means you belong to me. It's the only declaration he would respect, the only thing that would make him back off. I don't belong to anyone, Noelle said, the words coming out sharper than she intended. I know that, Kyrion replied, and there was something in his tone that suggested he meant it. But Vitaly doesn't, and now the entire room believes it. Which means I need to decide what to do with you. You could just let me go, Noelle suggested. I'll leave, go home, you'll never see me again. You think it's that simple? Kyrion's expression was almost pitying. You think you can walk away from this, from being seen with me, from being declared mine, and everything just goes back to normal? Noelle's stomach sank. Why not? Because men like Vitaly don't forget, Kyrion said. He'll see the declaration for what it really is, interference in his business, humiliation in front of peers. And once I'm not there to stop him, he'll wonder why I protected you. He'll wonder what you mean to me. And then he'll use you to get to me, to test my boundaries, to see if I'll follow through on that protection. That's insane, Noelle breathed. I'm no one. I'm just a server. I don't matter to any of this. You mattered enough to step in, Kyrion pointed out. You mattered enough to make me intervene. That alone makes you relevant, whether you want to be or not. Noelle felt the walls closing in, felt the weight of consequences she hadn't foreseen when she'd opened her stupid mouth. So what are you saying? That I'm trapped? That I have to, pretend to be your... I'm saying I need to think about this, Kyrion interrupted, pulling out his phone. And you need to be somewhere safe while I do. He made a call, speaking rapid Russian to whoever was on the other end, then looked back at her. My driver will take you home. Pack a bag. You'll stay at one of my properties until I sort this out. I can't just leave, Noelle protested. I have work tomorrow, I have responsibilities. Those responsibilities will still be there when this is resolved, Kyrion said firmly. Right now, your priority is staying alive long enough to return to them. The casual way he said it, as if her death was a real and immediate possibility, sent ice through Noelle's veins. This wasn't a game. This wasn't dramatic exaggeration. This was the world she'd stepped into when she thought she could be a hero. How long? She asked quietly. I don't know, Kyrion admitted. A few days, maybe a week. Long enough for the story to settle, for people to accept the narrative I'm building. What narrative? He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing through his expression. That you're important to me. Important enough to protect. Important enough that anyone who touches you answers to me personally. But that's not true, Noelle said, even as her heart did something complicated in her chest at the words. It doesn't have to be true, Kyrion replied. It only has to be believable. A black car pulled up to the curb below, sleek and expensive, and Kyrion gestured toward the exit. My driver, Alexei, will take you home and then to the property. Do what he says. Don't try to run, don't try to leave. For your own safety. Noelle wanted to argue, wanted to refuse, wanted to insist that she could handle her own life and didn't need protection from someone whose world had nearly killed her tonight. But the look in Kyrion's eyes stopped her. There was genuine concern there, buried under layers of control and calculation. He was dangerous, yes. Powerful, absolutely. But he was also, in this moment, trying to keep her alive. Okay, she said softly. I'll do what you say. Something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe, or approval. Smart choice. As she moved toward the door, his voice stopped her. Noelle. She turned back, and he was watching her with that same intense focus that had pinned her from across the ballroom earlier. Thank you, he said quietly. For what you tried to do. It was foolish, but it was also brave. And that kind of courage is rare where I come from. Noelle didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and left, following the directions to where Alexei waited by the car. As they pulled away from the venue, she looked back once and saw Kyrion still standing on the balcony, a dark silhouette against the lit windows, watching her go. She'd come to this event to earn some extra money and go home. Instead, she'd stepped into something she didn't understand, drawn the attention of one of the most dangerous men in the city, and apparently become important enough to protect. Nothing about her life had prepared her for this. Nothing about tonight made sense. But as the city lights blurred past the car window, Noelle couldn't shake the memory of Kyrion's eyes when he'd looked at her, the weight of his attention, the way he'd said her name like it meant something. Like she meant something. She was in serious trouble. And the worst part was, she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to be anywhere else. The apartment Alexei brought her to was nothing like Noelle expected. She'd braced herself for something ostentatious, all gold fixtures and marble floors, the kind of wealth that demanded to be noticed. Instead, he drove her to a quiet building in a good neighborhood, the kind of place where young professionals lived, where nothing stood out and everything felt safe and unremarkable. "Third floor," Alexei said in heavily accented English, handing her a key card. "All electronics. Very secure. Mr. Dobrov will contact you tomorrow." He drove away before she could ask questions, leaving her standing on the sidewalk with her hastily packed bag and a head full of surreal understanding that her life had just taken a sharp left turn into territory she'd never imagined navigating. The apartment was clean and modern, sparsely furnished in neutrals and soft grays. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a small park, and the kitchen was stocked with basics but nothing personal, nothing that suggested anyone actually lived here. It was a safe house, she realized. A place for people to disappear into when they needed to be invisible. Noelle set her bag down and sank onto the couch, finally letting the night catch up with her. Her hands were shaking. Had been shaking since the moment Kyrion Dobrov had fixed those winter eyes on her and declared her under his protection. Had been shaking through the car ride home, through throwing random clothes into a bag while trying to figure out what to tell her mother's nurse, through the drive here. She was in over her head. Way over her head. And the scary part was, she could still feel the way Kyrion had looked at her, could still hear the quiet intensity in his voice when he'd thanked her for being brave. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was fitful and full of dark eyes and danger dressed in expensive suits. Morning brought a knock at the door and a different driver, this one younger and less imposing than Alexei. "Miss St. Clair? Mr. Dobrov would like you to join him for breakfast." It wasn't a request. Nothing in Kyrion Dobrov's world seemed to be a request. But the driver's tone was respectful, and when Noelle said she needed a minute to get ready, he nodded and waited in the hallway without complaint. 20 minutes later, she was in another black car, being driven through morning traffic to a restaurant she'd only seen from the outside, the kind of place where reservations were impossible and the menu didn't list prices. They bypassed the front entrance entirely, going through a side door to a private room in the back. Kyrion stood as she entered, and Noelle was struck again by the presence of him, the way he seemed to command space without effort. He was dressed more casually than last night, black slacks and a dark gray shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, but he still radiated that same controlled power. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "You must be hungry." She wasn't, actually. Her stomach was in knots. But there was something about the matter-of-fact way he said it that made her realize this was an instruction, not an observation. So she sat, and when servers brought food, eggs Benedict, fresh fruit, pastries that probably cost more than her rent, she tried to eat even though every bite felt like cardboard. Kyrion ate in silence, watching her with that same assessing gaze from last night. Finally, when she'd managed half the eggs and couldn't pretend anymore, he spoke. "Tell me about yourself." Noelle looked up sharply. "What?" "If I'm going to protect you, I need to understand who you are," Kyrion said reasonably. "So tell me. Family, background, why you're working events where men like Vitaly conduct business. Why does it matter?" Noelle asked, defensiveness rising in her chest. "You said yourself this is temporary. A story for people to believe until things calm down." "It matters because the story needs to be credible," Kyrion replied, setting down his fork. "People will talk. They'll investigate. They'll look for cracks in the narrative. So I need details. Real details." Noelle considered refusing. Considered telling him that her life was none of his business, that he'd inserted himself into her problems and she didn't owe him her biography. But then she remembered Vitaly's cold eyes, remembered the casual way he'd reached for something that could have ended that young man's life, and she understood that this was the price of protection. "My mother has cancer," she said finally. "Stage 3. The treatments are expensive, and insurance only covers so much. I work 3 jobs to make up the difference, catering like last night, morning shifts at a cafe, weekend events. I barely sleep, but it's enough to keep up with the medical bills. Mostly." "Mostly," Kyrion repeated, and there was something careful in how he said it. "Sometimes I have to choose between paying the full amount or making rent," Noelle admitted. "Sometimes I have to delay appointments because I can't afford both the treatment and the consultation." But she's my mom, so I figure it out. Father? Gone. Left when I was 8, right after my brother died. Mom says he couldn't handle the grief, but I think he just couldn't handle responsibility. She hadn't meant to add that last part, but it slipped out, bitter and honest. Kyrion was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, I'm sorry about your brother. It was a long time ago, Noelle said, though the ache never really went away. That doesn't make it easier, Kyrion observed, and there was something in his voice that suggested he knew about loss, about grief that didn't fade with time. They sat in silence, and Noelle found herself studying him in return. Up close, in better light, she could see more details, the fine lines around his eyes that suggested he'd lived more than his 30-some years should contain, the way his jaw tightened when he was thinking, the careful way he held himself as if constantly aware of threats she couldn't see. Your turn, she said before she could stop herself. Kyrion's eyebrows rose slightly. My turn? You asked about me. I'm asking about you. If I'm supposed to be important enough to protect, don't I deserve to know who's protecting me? Something that might have been amusement crossed his face. That's fair. What do you want to know? The truth, Noelle said simply. Not the version people whisper about. The real version. Why does someone become what you are? The question hung between them, and for a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. That she'd overstepped, pushed too far, asked for something he didn't give anyone. But then he leaned back in his chair, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. I became this because I had no other choice, he said. My father ran a small operation in Moscow. Nothing major, just enough to survive. When I was 16, someone decided he was competition and needed to be eliminated. They killed him. Killed my mother. Killed my younger sister. He paused, and something dark passed through his eyes. I survived because I was out that night. Came home to find everything gone. Noelle's breath caught. Kyrion. I could have run, he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. Could have disappeared, started over somewhere else. But I was 16 and angry and I wanted revenge more than I wanted safety. So I took what was left of my father's network, and I built it into something bigger. Something that couldn't be touched. I made myself into someone no one would dare to harm. His eyes met hers. And along the way, I became exactly what I hated. The kind of person who inspires fear instead of respect. Who controls instead of leads. Who makes decisions that cost lives. But you saved that kid last night, Noelle pointed out. You could have let Vitaly do whatever he was planning. Instead, you intervened. I intervened because you intervened, Kyrion corrected. Because you reminded me that there's supposed to be a difference between control and cruelty. But don't mistake that for heroism, Noelle. I'm not a good man. I've done things that would make you walk away if you knew the details. Maybe, Noelle acknowledged. But you could have let Vitaly hurt me too. You didn't have to protect me. You chose to. And now you're here, Kyrion said, something complicated in his expression. In danger because of that choice. That's not heroism either. That's consequence. They finished breakfast in thoughtful silence, and when Kyrion's phone buzzed with messages that required attention, he stood to leave. But at the door, he paused. The apartment is yours for as long as you need it, he said. Alexei will check in daily. If you need anything, there's a number programmed into the phone on the counter. Call it. How long? Noelle asked, the same question from last night. I don't know yet, Kyrion admitted. Vitaly is making noise about being humiliated. I need to handle that carefully. He hesitated, then added, I'm sorry you got pulled into this. I pulled myself in, Noelle reminded him. When I opened my mouth. True, Kyrion agreed. But I'm still sorry. He left, and Noelle spent the rest of the day in the apartment, trying to process everything. She called her mother's nurse, made up a story about a last-minute opportunity working a multi-day event, promised to check in daily. She answered texts from friends with vague explanations. She sat by the window and watched normal people living normal lives and wondered how everything had changed so completely in less than 24 hours. That evening, a delivery arrived, dinner from an upscale restaurant, still warm. The driver said only, "Mr. Dobrov wanted to make sure you ate," and left before she could respond. The pattern continued for 3 days. Morning pickups for breakfast meetings where Kyrion asked questions and listened to her answers with that intense focus that made her feel like the only person in the world. Afternoons alone in the apartment. Evening meals delivered with no explanation. And slowly, despite every warning bell in her head, Noelle found herself looking forward to those breakfast meetings. Found herself wondering what they'd talk about. Found herself noticing details, the way Kyrion's accent thickened slightly when he was tired, the rare smile that appeared when something genuinely amused him, the careful distance he maintained even as he asked increasingly personal questions. On the 4th morning, when the car arrived, the driver took her somewhere different. Not the restaurant but an address she didn't recognize, in a neighborhood where buildings had security gates and doormen who looked like they doubled as bodyguards. The elevator required a key card. The hallway on the top floor had only one door. And when that door opened, Noelle found herself in Kyrion's personal space, a penthouse that was somehow both luxurious and Spartan, all clean lines and expensive materials but nothing unnecessary, nothing decorative. He was waiting in the living room, standing by windows that overlooked the entire city. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. Noelle's stomach tightened. "That sounds ominous." "It's complicated," Kyrion replied, turning to face her. "Vitaly's still making problems. He's convinced that you're a weakness he can exploit. He's been asking around about you, digging into your background." "Has he found anything?" Noelle asked, fear spiking through her chest. "He knows about your mother," Kyrion said gently. "About the medical bills, the hospital visits. He knows where you live, where you work." Noelle sank onto the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. "What does that mean?" "It means he's looking for leverage," Kyrion said, his voice hard with controlled anger. "It means he thinks if he can threaten what you care about, he can use you to get to me." "So what do we do?" Noelle asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Kyrion crossed the room, crouching in front of her chair so they were eye level. This close, she could see the genuine concern in his expression, the tension in his jaw. "I move your mother to a private facility," he said. "One of mine. Better care, better security. No expense. And I make it very clear to Vitaly that touching anything related to you means war." "I can't afford," Noelle started. "I'm not asking you to afford it," Kyrion interrupted. "I'm telling you this is what's going to happen. Your mother gets the best possible care, and Vitaly understands that you're not a target." "Why?" Noelle demanded, emotions she didn't understand tangling in her chest. "Why are you doing all this? I'm nobody to you. Just some server who made a stupid mistake." Kyrion's eyes held hers, and in them she saw something that made her breath catch. "You stopped being nobody the moment you tried to save someone in a room full of people who'd forgotten how to care," he said quietly. "You stopped being nobody when you looked at me and saw something worth challenging. And you stopped being nobody when I decided I'd burn down half this city before letting Vitaly touch you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning Noelle wasn't sure she was ready to examine. "Kyrion. Don't," he said, standing abruptly and putting distance between them. "Don't read into it. This is about principle. About not letting men like Vitaly think they can threaten what I've declared protected." But Noelle had seen his eyes. Had heard the way his voice softened on her name. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that he was lying. That whatever was happening between them was more than principle, more than strategy, more than protecting an asset. "When do we move her?" she asked, choosing to let him have the lie for now. "Today," Kyrion replied. "The facility is ready. I've already spoken to her current doctors, transferred her records. Alexei will handle the logistics." "Can I see it?" Noelle asked. "The facility? Before we move her?" Something in Kyrion's expression softened. Of course. That's why you're here. I wanted you to see everything before making the decision. The facility was beautiful. Not a hospital so much as a luxury care center, with private rooms that looked like hotel suites and staff that outnumbered patients 3-1. The head doctor walked them through the treatment plan, aggressive but humane, focused on quality of life as much as fighting the disease, and when he mentioned the cost, Noelle felt her chest tighten. I can't accept this, she said when they were alone in one of the consultation rooms. Kyrion, this is too much. I could never repay you for something like this. I'm not asking you to repay me, he said, his voice firm. This isn't a debt. This is what needs to happen to keep your mother safe and give her the best chance at recovery. But why? Noelle pressed, needing to understand. Why does it matter to you? My mother, my problems, they're not yours. Kyrion was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. My sister was 7 when she died. She had a smile that could light up entire rooms. She believed people were fundamentally good, that the world was safe, that our family was untouchable. He paused, something raw flickering across his face. She was wrong about all of it. And I've spent 15 years building a world where people like her can survive, where being good doesn't make you a target, where families don't get destroyed because someone decided they were inconvenient. I can't save my sister, he continued, meeting Noelle's eyes. But I can save your mother. And maybe that doesn't fix anything, maybe it doesn't change what I've become, but it's something. It's one good thing in a life full of necessary evils. Noelle felt tears prick her eyes, understanding flooding through her. This wasn't about her, not really. This was about a 7-year-old girl who'd smiled at the wrong world, about a 16-year-old boy who'd lost everything, about a man trying to find redemption in small acts of protection. Okay, she said softly. We move her. And thank you. For caring. Even if it's complicated. Everything's complicated, Kyrion replied, and something that might have been relief crossed his face. They moved her mother that afternoon. Noelle held her hand through the transport, explained the new facility, promised this was temporary until things stabilized. Her mother, weak but clear-eyed, studied Kyrion when he came to check on the arrangements. You're the one taking care of all this, she said, not a question. Yes, ma'am, Kyrion replied respectfully. Why? Because your daughter is brave and kind, and those qualities deserve protecting, Kyrion said simply. And because I can. Her mother looked between them, and something knowing passed through her expression. I see, she said quietly. Well. Thank you, Mr. Dobrov. For everything. When they left, Noelle's mother settled and comfortable in her new room. Kyrion drove them back himself instead of using a driver. The silence in the car was different than before, less tension, more understanding. She liked you, Noelle observed. She's a good judge of character, Kyrion replied. Is she? Noelle asked, glancing at him. Because she definitely thought there was something between us. Kyrion's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Is there? The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. Noelle thought about the past 4 days, about breakfast conversations and evening meals, about the way her heart did complicated things when he looked at her, about the weight of his attention and how she'd started craving it. I don't know, she said honestly. Is there supposed to be? I don't know either, Kyrion admitted. This wasn't, you weren't supposed to be anything more than a complication to manage. But then you kept surprising me. Kept being more than I expected. And now I look at you and I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that. What do you want to do with it? Noelle asked, her heart hammering. Kyrion pulled the car over, parking in a quiet spot overlooking the river. He turned to face her fully, and in his eyes was something vulnerable and real, something that made him look less like the Winter King and more like just a man trying to navigate feelings he didn't understand. I want to know you, he said quietly. Not as a complication, not as someone to protect. Just as you. I want to hear about your childhood and your dreams and what makes you laugh. I want to understand how someone who serves drinks at parties where people conduct terrible business can still believe in stepping in trying to help, in basic human decency. And then what? Noelle asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Kyrion admitted. I've never wanted to know someone before. Never let anyone get close enough to matter. But you, he stopped, shaking his head slightly. You make me want things I thought I'd given up on. Noelle reached out, her hand covering his on the gear shift. I'm scared, she said honestly. Of you, of this, of what it means. You're dangerous, Kyrion. Your world is dangerous. And I have no idea how to navigate any of it. I know, he said, turning his hand to lace his fingers through hers. And if you want to walk away, if you want me to set you up somewhere safe and never contact you again, I'll do it. No pressure, no obligation. You get to choose. And if I don't want to walk away? Noelle asked, her pulse racing. Then we figure this out, Kyrion said simply. Together. One day at a time. With all the complications and dangers and unknowns. But honestly, no lies, no games. Noelle looked at their joined hands, at this man who commanded empires and inspired fear but who was looking at her like she held something precious. She thought about safety and risk, about the smart choice and the real choice, about what her life had been and what it could become. Okay, she said finally. Let's figure it out. The kiss, when it came, was different than she'd expected. Not demanding or possessive but careful, almost tentative, as if Kyrion was afraid she might break. His hand came up to cup her face, gentle, and when she leaned into the touch, she felt him exhale against her mouth like he'd been holding his breath. This is probably a mistake, he murmured against her lips. Probably, Noelle agreed, kissing him again. They stayed parked by the river until the sun set, talking and kissing and learning the shape of each other's silences. And when Kyrion finally drove her back to the safe house, he walked her to the door and kissed her goodbye like it mattered, like she mattered. Tomorrow, he asked. Tomorrow, Noelle confirmed. The next 2 weeks fell into a pattern that felt almost normal, if you ignored the armed security and the fact that they couldn't go anywhere public together. Kyrion came by the apartment every evening after handling whatever business needed handling. They cooked dinner together, or rather, Noelle cooked while Kyrion watched and asked questions about techniques he'd never learned because he'd been too busy building an empire to learn basic life skills. They talked about everything. Her childhood in a neighborhood where hope was scarce but community was strong. His memories of Russia before everything went wrong. Her dreams of maybe going back to school someday, studying something that mattered. His quiet admission that he'd never thought about what came after, about what life looked like when you'd achieved all your goals and found they left you empty. What would you do? Noelle asked one night, curled up beside him on the couch. If you could walk away from all of this, what would you want instead? Kyrion was quiet for a long moment, his arm around her shoulders, his fingers absently playing with her hair. I used to think about that, he said finally. When I was younger, still angry but not quite as hardened. I'd imagine a normal life. A regular job. A family. Simple things. And now? Now I know too much, he said. Know what happens in the shadows, who runs the real operations, where the bodies are buried, literally. I couldn't just walk away and pretend I don't know. Couldn't build a normal life knowing what exists just under the surface. But if you could, Noelle pressed. Hypothetically. Hypothetically? Kyrion's mouth curved slightly. I'd want a house somewhere quiet. Not isolated, but peaceful. I'd want to wake up without immediately checking for threats. I'd want to read books I haven't had time for, learn to actually cook instead of just watching you do it, maybe teach at a university or mentor young people who don't realize they're standing at the same crossroads I was. That sounds nice, Noelle said softly. It's fantasy, Kyrion replied, but there was something wistful in his voice. The life I chose doesn't have exit doors. You know too much, you've made too many enemies, you've done too many things that people remember. You don't just retire from this world. Maybe not, Noelle agreed. But maybe you can start building towards something different. Even if it takes time. Kyrion kissed the top of her head, and she felt him smile against her hair. You're an optimist. I'm not sure how that survived working in my world. Stubbornness, Noelle said. And a general refusal to let reality crush basic hope. I like that about you, Kyrion murmured. Among other things. Those other things became clearer as time passed. The way she challenged him when she thought he was wrong, refusing to be intimidated by his reputation. The way she listened when he talked about the weight of decisions that affected lives. The way she made him laugh with dry observations about the absurdity of his lifestyle. The way she touched him, gentle and certain, like she wasn't afraid of what he represented. And Noelle learned things too. Learned that Kyrion read philosophy when he couldn't sleep, that he'd memorized poetry his mother used to recite, that he played chess with brutal efficiency but always let her think through her moves without rushing. Learned that he was capable of surprising gentleness, that his control extended to protecting people from his own darkness, that beneath the layers of power and danger was someone who still remembered how to care. But reality had a way of intruding on Sanctuary. 3 weeks after that first night, Alexei arrived at the apartment during dinner looking grim. We have a problem, he said in Russian, then remembering Noelle, switched to English. Vitaly made a move. Kyrion was on his feet immediately, his entire demeanor shifting from relaxed to dangerous in a heartbeat. What kind of move? He's calling a meeting, Alexei reported. Tomorrow night. All the major families. Says it's about establishing boundaries and respecting territories. Which means it's about me, Kyrion said flatly. About whether they think I've gotten soft, whether my protection of Noelle represents weakness they can exploit. What does that mean? Noelle asked, fear creeping into her voice. Kyrion turned to her, his expression carefully controlled. It means Vitaly's forcing a confrontation. He's going to argue that I overstepped, that my protection of you violated protocols, that I'm allowing personal feelings to interfere with business. Is he right? Noelle asked quietly. Yes, Kyrion admitted without hesitation. By the rules of our world, I should have let him handle his business. Should have stayed out of it. But I didn't, and now he's using that to challenge my authority. What happens at this meeting? Noelle asked. I defend my actions, Kyrion said. I make the case that protecting you is about maintaining my reputation, not about weakness. I remind everyone why challenging me directly is a bad idea. And I make sure Vitaly understands that pushing this further will cost him more than he's willing to pay. And if that doesn't work? Noelle pressed. Kyrion's jaw tightened. Then things get complicated. I should come with you, Noelle said suddenly. To the meeting. If this is about me, about whether I'm a weakness or a strategic asset, shouldn't I be there? Absolutely not, Kyrion said immediately. These meetings aren't safe, Noelle. People bring armed security, tempers run high, and things can go wrong quickly. I won't risk you. But keeping me hidden makes it look like you're ashamed, Noelle argued. Like you're not confident in your decision. If I'm there, if they see me, if they understand that I'm not just some random complication but someone you chose to protect, doesn't that make a stronger statement? Alexei made a sound that might have been agreement, and Kyrion shot him a dark look. Don't encourage this. She has a point, Alexei said carefully. If you show up alone, it looks defensive. If you show up with her, it looks confident. Like you're saying, I made this choice, I stand by it, and I dare you to challenge me. Kyrion looked between them, conflict clear in his expression. Finally, he turned back to Noelle. If you come, you stay by my side. You don't speak unless I indicate you can. You don't react to anything anyone says. And if I tell you to leave, you leave immediately. Understood? Understood, Noelle agreed, trying to ignore the fear curling in her stomach. The next evening, Kyrion arrived at the apartment dressed in a dark suit that made him look every inch the dangerous man he was. He helped Noelle into a simple black dress, elegant but understated, expensive but not flashy, and as they drove to the meeting location, he briefed her on protocols. The meeting will be in Russian, he explained. I'll translate key points quietly. Don't react to anything you hear, even if it's about you. These men respect strength and control. Emotion is weakness to them. What about you? Noel asked. Are you allowed to show emotion? I'm allowed to show calculated emotion, Kyrion replied. Anger that serves a purpose, intimidation that reinforces boundaries. But never vulnerability. Never anything that suggests I can be manipulated. The meeting was held in a private room at an upscale club, the kind of place where cameras didn't reach and waitstaff knew not to remember faces. As they entered, Noel felt the weight of attention shift to her, felt dozens of eyes assessing, calculating, measuring her against some standard she didn't understand. Kyrion's hand settled on her lower back, a gesture that was both possessive and protective, and she stayed close to his side as he greeted various men with the kind of formal politeness that barely concealed underlying tensions. Vitaly was there, of course, looking smug and dangerous. When his eyes landed on Noel, something ugly flickered through them, but Kyrion's presence kept him at a distance. The meeting started formally, discussions about territories, about recent problems, about maintaining order. But everyone in the room knew this was all preamble, that the real business would come later. And sure enough, after an hour of careful conversation, Vitaly finally made his move. I want to address something that affects all of us, he said in Russian, his voice carrying through the room. The matter of Kyrion Dobrov's recent intervention in my business. Kyrion's expression didn't change, but Noel felt him tense beside her. Careful, Vitaly, he said in Russian, his voice dangerously soft. Choose your words carefully. I'm only stating facts, Vitaly replied. 3 weeks ago, at the Foundation Gala, you interfered when I was handling an internal matter. You declared protection over someone who had no business inserting herself into things she didn't understand. And in doing so, you undermined my authority in front of everyone present. I intervened because your internal matter was creating a scene at a public event, Kyrion replied coolly. And I declared protection because it suited my purposes. Since when do I need to explain my strategic decisions to you? Since those decisions affect the respect we all depend on, Vitaly shot back. You're telling me that a random server girl matters more than maintaining proper protocols? That your personal interests override business? The room went very quiet. Noel understood enough Russian to follow the gist, and she realized this was the crux, whether Kyrion was acting out of strategic calculation or personal weakness. Kyrion stood, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. When he spoke, his voice was soft but carried absolute authority. Let me be very clear about something. Nothing I do is random. Nothing I decide lacks strategy. And nothing about my protection of Noelle St. Clair represents weakness or personal compromise. He pulled Noelle gently to her feet beside him, his hand steady on her arm. This woman intervened in your business, Vitaly, not because she was stupid or naive, but because she has something most of us lost a long time ago, a conscience. She saw someone in danger and tried to help. That kind of instinct, that kind of immediate courage, is valuable. Not common. Valuable. I protected her because I recognized that value, Kyrion continued, his eyes moving around the room, making sure everyone understood. I protected her because I decided that someone willing to risk herself to help a stranger is someone worth keeping alive. And I protected her because I wanted to send a very clear message, that in my territory, basic human decency is not a liability to be punished. Pretty words, Vitaly sneered. But they don't change the fact that you've let personal feelings compromise your judgment. Personal feelings, Kyrion repeated, and something dangerous flashed in his eyes. Tell me, Vitaly, do you know why I've survived 15 years in this business? Why I control half this city while others have risen and fallen? Because you're ruthless, Vitaly said. Because I'm strategic, Kyrion corrected. Because I make calculated decisions and I follow through on them. Because I don't let emotion drive me, I let logic guide me toward outcomes that serve my interests. He took a step toward Vitaly, and the older man actually stepped back. Noelle St. Clair is now part of my interests. I've decided she represents value, strategic, personal, it doesn't matter. What matters is that I've declared her protected, and that declaration stands. Challenge it, and you challenge me. Test it, and you test boundaries you really don't want to test. Are we clear? The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone in the room understood that Kyrion had just drawn a line, had just made Noelle's safety a direct extension of his authority. To threaten her now would be to declare war on him personally. Vitaly's face was red with suppressed fury, but he wasn't stupid enough to push further. Crystal clear, he said through clenched teeth. Good, Kyrion said, his voice returning to normal conversational tones. Then let's move on to actual business instead of wasting time on matters that are already settled. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. Noelle barely heard the discussions that followed, her heart still racing from the confrontation, from the absolute authority in Kyrion's voice when he defended her, from the realization that he'd just wagered his reputation on her value. When they finally left, hours later, Kyrion was quiet in the car. Noelle watched him, trying to read his expression, but his face was carefully neutral. That was terrifying, she said finally. It was necessary, Kyrion replied. Vitaly had to understand that challenging my protection of you wasn't negotiable. You called me valuable, Noelle said softly. Strategic value. Yes. Is that really what I am to you? She asked. A strategic asset? Kyrion turned to look at her fully, and in his eyes was something raw and honest. No, he said quietly. But that's what I could tell them without showing weakness. In that room, I can't admit that you're more than strategy, that you're more than calculation. I can't tell them that I look at you and feel things I thought died with my family. Can't tell them that protecting you has nothing to do with value and everything to do with the fact that losing you would break something I didn't know I still had to break. Noelle's breath caught. Kyrion. But I can tell you, he continued, his hand finding hers. Here, away from them, I can tell you the truth. You're not an asset. You're not strategy. You're the first thing in 15 years that's made me want something beyond control and power and revenge. You're what hope feels like when I'd forgotten hope existed. Tears pricked Noelle's eyes. This is crazy. Everything about this is crazy. I know, Kyrion agreed. You're a woman who works 3 jobs to save her mother, and I'm a man who built an empire on other people's fear. We shouldn't make sense. But somehow we do. What happens now? Noelle asked, the question she kept asking because the answer kept changing. Now we figure out how to build something real in a world built on lies, Kyrion said. Now we try to be better than what we're expected to be. Now he paused, something vulnerable crossing his face. Now I ask if you want this. Really want this. Because walking away now would be hard, but walking away later would be impossible. Noelle thought about safety and risk, about the smart choice and the true choice, about what her heart was telling her versus what logic insisted was madness. She thought about Kyrion's eyes when he looked at her, about his careful hands and his rare smiles, about the way he defended her in that room full of dangerous men, about the gentleness he showed when no one else could see. I want this, she said firmly. I want you. All the complications and dangers and unknowns. I want to figure out how we build something good in your world. I want tomorrow and the day after and however many days we can manage. Kyrion kissed her then, deep and thorough, like she was air and he'd been drowning. And when they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. Then let's go home, he said softly. Which home? Whichever one you want, Kyrion replied. The apartment, my place, anywhere you feel safe. As long as we're together. They ended up at his penthouse, and that night marked a shift. Not just physically, though that was there too, careful and intense and full of discoveries, but emotionally. They crossed a line from maybe to definitely, from protection to partnership, from strategy to something that felt dangerously close to love. The weeks that followed weren't easy. There were challenges, from Vitaly, who never quite gave up looking for angles, from other members of Kyrion's organization who questioned whether his judgment was compromised, from the simple logistical reality of building a relationship in a world that didn't allow for normal things like dinner dates and lazy weekends. But there were good things too. Noelle's mother stabilized, the aggressive treatment showing results. Kyrion began teaching her about his business, not the violent parts, but the strategic thinking, the planning, the way he'd built a network that could function without constant intervention. She started helping with legitimate investments, using her natural intelligence to spot patterns he missed. They found rhythms. Morning coffee before Kyrion left to handle business. Evening check-ins where they shared the day's complications. Late nights talking about everything and nothing. Small moments of normalcy carved out of an abnormal life. "I want to show you something," Kyrion said one evening, 6 months after that first night at the gala. He drove them out of the city, to a property Noelle had never seen, a house on the outskirts, surrounded by trees, quiet and peaceful. It was beautiful in an understated way, all clean lines and natural light, the kind of place that felt like a refuge. "What is this?" Noelle asked as they walked through empty rooms. "Possibility," Kyrion replied. "I bought it 3 years ago, back when I still thought maybe I could build something different someday. Never did anything with it because I didn't see the point. But now," he turned to face her. "Now I'm thinking about that hypothetical conversation we had. About what comes after. About building towards something different." "Are you saying," Noelle started, hope blooming in her chest. "I'm saying I'm starting to exit," Kyrion said carefully. "Not immediately, not recklessly, but strategically. Selling off pieces, consolidating the legitimate operations, grooming successors for the parts one can't walk away from immediately. It'll take years, maybe 5, maybe 10. But I'm working toward it. Toward this." He gestured at the house. "Toward a life that's ours, not dictated by what I built before I met you." Noelle felt tears spill over. "You're really doing this? Building an exit?" "For you," Kyrion said, pulling her close. "Because you make me want that hypothetical future. Because you're worth walking away from power for. Because I'm tired of being the Winter King and I want to be just Kyrion, the man you chose despite every reason not to." "I love you," Noelle said, the words coming naturally, inevitably. "I love you and I want that future and I want to build it with you." "I love you too," Kyrion replied, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I thought I could love anything. More than control or power or revenge. You're what I choose, Noelle. Every time. Forever." The kiss that sealed that promise was different than all the others, less urgent, more certain. Full of hope and possibilities and the quiet understanding that they'd found something rare, something worth protecting, something worth building a whole new life around. Standing in that empty house that represented their future, Noelle thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, working 3 jobs, barely surviving, convinced that her life would always be about scraping by and hoping for better. And she thought about who she was now, loved by a dangerous man who was trying to become better, building something real in impossible circumstances, believing in futures that seemed impossible. "Tell me what you see," Kyrion said softly, his arms around her, both of them looking out at the trees beyond the windows. "I see home," Noelle replied. "I see safety. I see mornings drinking coffee on that porch and evenings reading by whatever fireplace you install. I see a life we build together, one decision at a time, one day at a time. I see us being happy." "That's exactly what I see," Kyrion agreed. "Let's make it real." And in that moment, standing in an empty house that would someday be filled with their life together, Noelle believed they would. Believed that the girl who'd stepped in to help a stranger and the man who'd built an empire on control had somehow found each other, had somehow chosen each other, and were somehow going to build something good out of the ruins of what they'd been before. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing about their life would be easy. But it would be theirs, honest and real and worth every complication. "Take me home," Noelle said softly. "Which home?" Kyrion asked, echoing her question from months ago. "Whichever one has you in it," Noelle replied. Kyrion smiled, one of those rare, genuine smiles that transformed his entire face, and kissed her once more before leading her back to the car. And as they drove toward whatever came next, Noelle held his hand and believed in possibilities she'd never imagined before, in futures that seemed impossible and in love that had found them in the least likely place. The girl who'd served drinks and kept her head down had found her voice. The man who'd built walls around his heart had let someone in. And together, they were building something that mattered more than survival or safety or strategy. They were building hope. And in the world they came from, that was the rarest and most dangerous thing of all. But also, somehow, the most worthwhile. Hey loves. If you made it to the end, thank you for staying with me through Kyrion and Noelle's story. I know it wasn't the typical Mafia romance you might be used to, less action, more emotion, quieter in some ways, but I hope it hit just as deep. I wanted to write something about finding unexpected softness in hard places. About two people who shouldn't work on paper but somehow do in practice. About the kind of love that makes you want to be better than what the world expects you to be. Tell me in the comments, what moment hit you hardest? Was it when Kyrion first protected her? When he admitted what she really meant? That empty house at the end? I'd love to know what resonated. And if this story made you feel something, made you believe in complicated love stories and impossible possibilities, then it did exactly what I hoped it would do. Thanks for listening. Thanks for feeling. Thanks for being here. Until the next story.